George pressed his back against the cold concrete wall, his breath shallow and rapid. The voices were getting closer. He hadn't meant to be here. He hadn't meant to hear anything. But now, hiding in the dim corridor of the old factory building, he realized that some secrets were never meant to be discovered. It started 3 hours earlier, on an ordinary Tuesday morning. George worked as a maintenance supervisor at Hartwell Industrial Complex, a sprawling factory on the edge of town. For 15 years, he'd walked those halls, fixed broken machines, and kept to himself. He was 52, divorced, and lived alone in a small apartment with a cat named Murphy. His life was predictable, safe, boring even that morning. His supervisor called him about a leak in Section D, the old wing, the part of the factory that had been mostly shut down 2 years ago when the company downsized. George grabbed his toolbox and headed over, his boots echoing on the empty floors. Section D always felt different. Quieter. Colder. The machine sat silent, covered in dust. The windows were grimy, letting in only thin streams of gray light. George found the leak quickly a burst pipe near the old storage rooms. Nothing serious. He knelt down, started working, and that's when he heard them. Voices low and tense. Coming from the room at the end of the hall, George froze. No one was supposed to be in Section D. Management had made that clear. The wing was off limits except for maintenance. He tilted his head, listening. 2 men, maybe 3. Their words were muffled, but something about the tone made his stomach tighten. Curiosity pulled at him. He shouldn't listen. He should finish the job and leave. But his feet moved before his mind could stop them. Slowly, carefully, he crept down the hallway toward the voices. Before we go any further, if you're enjoying this story, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our next emotional tale. Trust me, you'll want to see how this ends. George reached the door. It was cracked open just enough. He leaned closer, his heart pounding in his ears. Inside, he could see shadows moving. 3 men in dark jackets. One of them wore a guard uniform. The company's security badge glinted under the fluorescent light. The guard was speaking. His voice was sharp, frustrated. I'm telling you, they're moving it Friday night. Midnight. No one will even know it's gone until Monday morning. George's hand gripped the edge of the doorframe. Moving what? His mind raced. Another man spoke, deeper voice calm. And you're sure about the route? Positive, the guard replied. I've been watching the schedules for weeks. The truck leaves through the east gate. 2 drivers. No extra security. It's clean. George felt his blood turn cold. This wasn't a normal conversation. This was a plan, a theft. And it was happening in 3 days. He needed to leave. Now, he took a step back, but his toolbox shifted, and a wrench clinked against the metal handle. The voices inside stopped. George's heart slammed against his ribs. He didn't breathe. He didn't move. Then he heard footsteps, fast, coming toward the door. He turned and ran. George didn't stop until he reached the main building. His lungs burned. His hands shook as he pushed through the heavy double doors and stepped into the crowded hallway. Workers moved past him, chatting, laughing, carrying coffee cups. Everything felt surreal. Normal, like the world hadn't just tilted. Sideways, he ducked into the men's bathroom and locked himself in a stall. He sat on the closed lid, breathing hard, trying to think. What had he just heard? A robbery. They were planning to steal something from the factory, something big enough to require watching schedules and planning routes. And one of them was a guard. Someone who worked here. Someone George might have seen 100 times in the break room. He pulled out his phone with trembling fingers. Should he call the police? Tell his supervisor. But what if he was wrong? What if he'd misunderstood? He replayed the conversation in his mind. No, he hadn't misunderstood. The guard had been clear. Friday night, midnight, East Gate. George felt a knot tighten in his chest. If he reported this and nothing happened, he'd look paranoid. Crazy. But if he stayed quiet and something was stolen, he'd be the guy who knew and did nothing. He decided to wait. To think, to figure out what to do, the rest of the day dragged. George went through the motions fixing machines, filling out reports, nodding at coworkers. But his mind was somewhere else. He kept seeing the guard's face in his memory, trying to place him. Was it Martinez from the night shift? Or Jackson, the older guy who always smiled too much? When 5 o'clock came, George grabbed his jacket and headed for the parking lot. The air outside was crisp, the sky dimming to a bruised purple. He climbed into his old pickup truck and sat there for a moment, staring at the factory. The lights glowed in the windows. It looked so ordinary, so safe. But George knew better now. He drove home in silence, his hands tight on the wheel. When he pulled into his apartment complex, he noticed a black sedan parked across the street. Tinted windows. Engine off. Probably nothing. Just someone visiting a neighbor. But as George climbed the stairs to his apartment, he glanced back. The sedan was still there. Inside, Murphy greeted him with a soft meow, rubbing against his legs. George fed the cat, made himself a sandwich he didn't eat, and sat on the couch staring at the TV without watching it. His phone sat on the coffee table. He kept picking it up, then putting it down. Finally. He typed a text to his old friend Ray, a former cop who now worked private security. Need to talk. Something weird happened at work. Can I call you? Ray replied almost immediately. Sure. What's up? George hesitated. Then he called. Ray listened without interrupting as George explained what he'd overheard. When George finished, there was a long silence on the other end. Hey, George, Ray said slowly, you need to be careful. If these guys are serious, and if one of them is inside security, you could be in real danger. They might have seen you. George's stomach dropped. You think they know it was me? Maybe. Maybe not. But you need to assume they're covering their tracks. Don't go back to Section D. Don't ask questions. And for God's sake, don't try to play hero. George swallowed hard. So what do I do? Report it. Anonymously if you want. But don't sit on this. If something gets stolen and you knew about it, that's on you. After they hung up, George sat in the dark living room, his mind spinning. Ray was right. He had to report it. But to who? The company? The police? He decided he'd call the police in the morning. He'd tell them everything and let them handle it. But that night, as George lay in bed, he heard something outside his window. A car door shutting. Footsteps on gravel. He got up and peeked through the blinds. The black sedan was parked in front of his building now, and 2 men were standing beside it, looking up at his apartment. George stepped back from the window, his pulse hammering in his throat. The 2 men stood in the parking lot, lit by the yellow glow of a street lamp. One of them was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket. The other was leaner, hands in his pockets, scanning the building. Were they looking for him? George moved quietly through his apartment, double-checking the locks on the door and windows. Murphy sat on the couch, blinking sleepily, unaware of the danger. George grabbed his phone and thought about calling Ray again. Or the police. But what would he say? 2 men are standing outside my building. It wasn't a crime. He watched through a gap in the blinds. After a few minutes, the men climbed back into the sedan and drove away. George exhaled, his shoulders sagging with relief. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe they were just lost. Maybe he was being paranoid. But sleep didn't come easy that night. The next morning, George called in sick to work. He told his supervisor he had a stomach bug and needed the day off. It wasn't entirely a lie. His stomach was twisted in knots. He spent the morning pacing his apartment, drinking too much coffee, trying to decide what to do. Finally, around noon, he drove to the police station. It was a small building on the edge of town, brick and glass, with a flagpole out front. George parked, took a deep breath, and walked inside. The officer at the front desk was young, maybe late 20s, with a buzz cut and a bored expression. George explained that he needed to report something he'd overheard at work. The officer listened, typing notes into a computer, and then asked George to wait. 10 minutes later, a detective came out. His name was Carter. Mid-40s, graying hair, tired eyes. He led George into a small interview room and closed the door. Tell me what you heard, Carter said, leaning back in his chair. George recounted. The entire story, the voices in Section D, the guard, the plan to steal something Friday night. Carter listened without interrupting, occasionally jotting notes on a pad. When George finished, Carter tapped his pen against the table. Do you know what they were planning to steal? No, George admitted. They didn't say. You didn't see their faces clearly? Not really. Just shadows. But one of them was definitely a guard. I saw the uniform. Carter nodded slowly. Okay, we'll look into it, guide. In the meantime, I'd advise you to stay away from Section D and keep this quiet. If these guys are serious, you don't want them knowing you talked to us. George left the station feeling both relieved and anxious. He'd done the right thing, but now what? We couldn't just go back to work and pretend everything was normal. That evening, his phone rang. Unknown number. George hesitated, then answered. Hello? Silence. Then a voice low and calm. George, we need to talk. George's blood turned to ice. Who is this? You know who this is? You were in Section D yesterday. You heard things you weren't supposed to hear. George's mind raced. Did they know his name? How did they get his number? I don't know what you're talking about, George stammered. The voice chuckled, cold and humorless. Don't play dumb. You went to the police today. That was a mistake. George's stomach dropped. They'd been watching him, following him. Here's what's going to happen, the voice continued. You're going to forget what you heard. You're going to tell the police you made a mistake? No? You were confused, stressed, whatever. And then you're going to go back to your boring little life and keep your mouth shut, if I don't. George's voice cracked. Now, then you'll find out what happens to people who stick their nose where it doesn't belong. The line went dead. George stood frozen in his kitchen, the phone still pressed to his ear. His hands trembled. My mind screamed at him to pack a bag and leave town. But where would he go? And for how long? He called Detective Carter immediately and told him about the call. Carter's voice turned serious. They're threatening you. That changes things. I'm going to send a patrol car to your building tonight, and I want you to come back to the station tomorrow. We need to move fast. That night, George barely slept. A police car sat outside his building, the officers switching shifts every few hours. George watched through the window, feeling both protected and trapped. The next morning, Carter called with news. We've identified the guard. His name is Eric Brennan. He works night security at your factory. We're bringing him in for questioning. George felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this would be over soon, but then Carter added, there's something else. We did some digging. Whatever they're planning to steal, it's not just factory equipment. We think it's connected to something much bigger. George sat in Detective Carter's office, his hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Across the desk, Carter pulled up a file on his computer and turned the screen toward George. Hartwell Industrial Complex, Carter began, isn't just a factory. 3 months ago, they signed a contract with the Department of Defense. They've been manufacturing specialized components for military equipment, high-value materials, rare metals. Some of it classified. George stared at the screen, his mind reeling. I had no idea. Most employees don't, Carter said. It's kept quiet for security reasons. But here's the thing. If someone inside knows about it, and they know when shipments are moving, they could steal millions of dollars worth of material in a single night. And sell it? George asked. Exactly. There are buyers, foreign governments, criminal organizations, people who'd pay a fortune for that kind of access. Carter leaned forward. Eric Brennan, the guard you overheard, has debts, gambling, bad investments. We pulled his financials. He's drowning, which makes him the perfect target for recruitment. George felt sick. This wasn't just some petty theft. This was espionage. Treason, maybe. What happens now? George asked quietly. We're watching Brennan. We've got surveillance on him and the factory. But here's the problem. We don't know who else is involved. The 2 men you overheard, we haven't identified them yet. If they're working with someone higher up in the company, they might have access we can't track. Carter paused, his expression serious. George, I'm going to be honest with you. You're a witness. You're also a threat to them. As long as this operation is active, you're in danger. George swallowed hard. So what do I do? can offer you protection. Keep officers outside your building. Monitor your phone. But the safest option? You lay low. Don't go back to work until this is over. Stay home. Stay quiet. George nodded, though every part of him hated the idea of hiding. He'd worked at Hartwell for 15 years. He wasn't a hero, but he wasn't a coward either. That afternoon, George returned to his apartment. The police car was still parked outside, a small comfort. He locked the door, fed Murphy, and tried to distract himself with television. But his mind kept circling back to Friday night. Midnight, the East Gate. Tomorrow was Thursday. One day left before the robbery. He wondered if the police would stop it in time, or if Brennan and his accomplices would slip through. Around 8 that evening, George's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. You made a choice. Now live with it. George's heart sank. He screenshotted the message and sent it to Carter immediately. The detective called him back within minutes. George, I need you to stay calm, Carter said. This is intimidation. We're trying to scare you into backing down. But we're close. We're going to catch them. What if you don't? George's voice was barely a whisper. We will. But Carter's confidence didn't erase the fear that coiled in George's chest. He spent the night on the couch, unable to relax, jumping at every sound outside. Friday morning arrived gray and cold. George woke to a call from Carter. We've made progress, the detective said. We identified one of the men from surveillance footage near the factory. His name is Luis Vargas. He's got a record smuggling, theft, connections to organized crime. We're closing in, and Brennan, still under watch. He's nervous. We think he knows we're onto him, but he hasn't made a move yet. Tonight's the test. If they go through with it, we'll be ready. George hung up and spent the day pacing. The hours crawled. He kept checking the clock. Noon 3:69. As midnight approached, George couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed his jacket and keys and headed for the door. Where are you going? The officer outside his building stepped forward, concerned. To the factory, George said. I have to see this. Sir, that's not a good idea. I'm going. George's voice was firm. You can follow me if you want, but I'm not sitting here waiting. The officer radioed it in, and reluctantly, he and his partner escorted George. They drove through the dark streets toward Hartwell Industrial Complex. The factory looming ahead like a sleeping giant. Police cars were already positioned around the perimeter, hidden in shadows. Carter met George at the edge of the parking lot. His expression, a mix of frustration and understanding. You shouldn't be here, Carter said. I know, George replied. But I need to see this through. Carter sighed. Stay in the car. Do not get out. Understood, George nodded. They waited. 11:45, 11:50, 11:50-5, and then... Just after midnight, headlights appeared at the east gate. A truck, slow and deliberate, rolling toward the exit. Carter spoke into his radio. All units, move in. The night exploded with sound and light. Police cars roared forward from every direction, sirens wailing, headlights cutting through the darkness. The truck at the east gate jerked to a stop, trapped between two patrol cars. George watched from inside Carter's unmarked sedan, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. Officers poured out, weapons drawn, shouting commands. Driver hands where we can see them. Out of the vehicle now. The truck's door opened slowly. A man stepped out, hands raised, face pale in the glare of the headlights. George didn't recognize him. Behind him, a second man emerged from the passenger side, also surrendering. Carter was already moving, striding toward the truck with a team of officers. George couldn't hear the words, but he saw the tension in every movement. One officer climbed into the back of the truck, while others secured the drivers. Minutes felt like hours. Then Carter turned and walked back toward the sedan. His face was grim. He opened the door and looked at George. The truck's loaded. Military-grade components. Exactly what we suspected? Street value. Close to $5 million? George exhaled, a wave of relief washing over him. You got them. You got the drivers. But Brennan and Vargas aren't here. Carter's jaw tightened. They're not stupid. They sent others to do the dirty work. We have units at Brennan's house and Vargas's last known address, but so far, nothing. George's relief turned to dread. So they're still out there now, but we'll find them. They can't run forever. The officers processed the scene, photographing evidence, questioning the drivers. George watched it all unfold, feeling strangely numb. He'd helped stop a major crime, but the men who'd threatened him were still free. Carter drove George back to his apartment an hour later. The streets were empty, the city asleep. When they pulled up to the building, Carter turned to George. "You did the right thing," Carter said. "I know it doesn't feel like it right now. But you saved the company millions of dollars, maybe more. And you stopped something that could have had serious national security implications?" George nodded, but the words felt hollow. "Will I ever be safe again?" Carter didn't answer right away. Then he said, "We're going to catch them. I promise you that. Until then, stay vigilant. Keep your doors locked. Report anything suspicious. We'll have patrols checking on you regularly." George climbed out of the car and walked up to his apartment. Inside, Murphy greeted him with a soft meow. George sank onto the couch, exhausted, his mind still racing. The next 2 days were a blur. George stayed home, avoiding the news, avoiding his phone. He felt like a prisoner in his own life. Every sound outside made him jump. Every car that drove past made him check the window. Then, on Sunday afternoon, Carter called, "We got them." George sat up straight. Both of them. Brennan tried to flee the state. We picked him up at a bus station in Ohio. Vargas was hiding at a friend's place in the city. Both are in custody. It's over, George. George felt something break loose inside him. Relief, exhaustion, disbelief all at once. It's really over. It's over. They're facing federal charges. Theft of government property, conspiracy, attempted smuggling. They're looking at serious prison time. And with the evidence we have, including your testimony, they won't be getting out anytime soon. George closed his eyes, letting the news sink in. "Thank you," No, Carter said firmly. "Thank you. Without you, we never would have known. You put yourself at risk to do the right thing. That takes guts." After they hung up, George sat in silence for a long time. Murphy jumped into his lap, purring, and George stroked the cat's fur absently. It was over. He was safe. But something had changed. He'd seen a side of the world he'd never wanted to see. Greed, danger, betrayal. He thought about going back to work, walking those familiar halls. Fixing machines? Keeping his head down? But could he ever see that place the same way again? The next morning, George called his supervisor and said he was ready to return. When he arrived at Hartwell on Monday, the factory felt different, quieter, more serious. Word had spread about the arrests. Though most employees didn't know the full story, George walked through the main building, past the break room. Toward Section D, when he reached the hallway where it had all started, he paused. The door to the storage room was closed now, sealed off. A reminder of what had almost happened. His coworker, Linda, stopped beside him. "Crazy, wasn't it?" she said. "I heard they almost got away with millions." "Yeah," George said quietly. "Almost. Good thing someone stopped them." George didn't reply. He just nodded and walked on. 3 weeks passed. George settled back into his routine, but everything felt slightly off-center. He fixed pipes and machines, filled out reports, ate lunch in the break room. On the surface, life looked the same. But George knew better. He'd learned that ordinary moments could crack open and reveal something dangerous underneath. That doing the right thing didn't always feel good. That safety was more fragile than he'd ever realized. Detective Carter called him one afternoon to update him on the case. Brennan and Vargas had both pleaded guilty in exchange for reduced sentences. The drivers had cooperated, giving up names of the buyers they'd been working with. The investigation had expanded, reaching into networks George couldn't even imagine. "Started something big," Carter told him. "Bigger than you know. Because of you, we shut down an entire smuggling operation. Saved lives, maybe? Definitely protected national security." George didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who'd stumbled into the wrong place at the wrong time and somehow survived. but he also felt something else. Something he hadn't expected. He felt awake. For 15 years, George had moved through life on autopilot. Work, home, sleep, repeat. He'd convinced himself that safety meant staying small. Staying quiet, not making waves. Now he understood that safety wasn't the same as living. One evening, George sat on his couch with Murphy curled beside him. He picked up his phone and scrolled through job listings. He didn't know what he was looking for. Maybe something new. Maybe just a reminder that the world was bigger than Hartwell Industrial Complex. Then he saw an ad. A community center across town was looking for a maintenance supervisor. The pay was less than Hartwell, but the description mentioned working with kids' programs, helping seniors, supporting local events. George stared at the listing for a long time. Then he clicked apply. 2 weeks later, he got the interview. The director of the center was a woman named Angela, warm and energetic, with silver hair and laugh lines around her eyes. She asked him about his experience, his skills, why he wanted the job. George thought about lying, saying something safe and simple, but instead, he told her the truth. "I've spent a long time playing it safe," he said, "keeping my head down, not getting involved. But recently, I learned that sometimes you have to stand up, even when it's scary, even when it's not convenient. And I want to work somewhere that means something, somewhere I can make a difference." Angela smiled. "When can you start?" George gave his 2 weeks' notice at Hartwell. His supervisor was surprised but understanding. His co-workers threw him a small goodbye lunch in the break room. Linda gave him a card signed by everyone. "You're really leaving?" she asked. "Yeah," George said. "Time for something new." On his last day, George walked through Section D one final time. The hallway was empty, the machine silent. He stood outside the storage room, where he'd overheard the guard, where everything had changed. He thought about fear, about choices, about the way a single moment could reshape an entire life. Then he turned and walked away. His new job at the community center started the following Monday. The building was older, worn, but full of life. Kids running through the halls, seniors playing cards in the lounge, volunteers organizing food drives. George fixed leaky faucets, replaced light bulbs, painted walls, and helped set up for events. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt real. One afternoon, a boy about 10 years old approached him. "Are you the new maintenance guy?" "That's me," George said. "Cool. My name's Danny. Can you teach me how to fix stuff?" George smiled. "Sure. What do you want to learn?" They spent the next hour working on a broken shelf in the game room. George showed Danny how to use a drill, how to measure twice and cut once.
Oh.
How to take pride in doing something well. As they worked, George realized something. He'd spent so much of his life invisible, unnoticed. But here, in this small moment, he mattered. Not because he'd stopped a robbery or saved millions of dollars, but because he was showing up, being present, helping. That night, George sat on his balcony with a cup of coffee, watching the city lights. Murphy sat beside him, purring softly. The air was cool, the sky clear. His phone buzzed. A text from Carter. "Thought you'd want to know. Final sentencing came through today. Brennan got 8 years. Vargas got 12. Justice served. Thanks again for everything, George. You're one of the good ones." George smiled and put the phone down. He thought about Eric Brennan, the guard who'd gambled his life away on greed. He wondered what choices Brennan could have made differently. What moments had led him down that path? And he thought about his own choices. The decision to listen when he could have walked away. The decision to report what he'd heard. The decision to stand up, even when it was terrifying. Life was full of small moments like that. Moments where you had to choose who you wanted to be. George finished his coffee and stood up. Murphy stretched and followed him inside. Tomorrow, he'd wake up early and head to the community center. There was a broken heating unit in the gym and a leaky pipe in the kitchen. Small problems, ordinary work. But George had learned that ordinary moments mattered. That showing up mattered. That doing the right thing, even when it was hard, even when no one was watching, mattered. He'd spent 15 years playing it safe. Now, at 52, he was finally learning how to live, and that, he realized, was the real secret. Not the one he'd overheard in Section A, but the one he'd discovered in himself. The secret that courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about being afraid and choosing to act anyway. It was about knowing that one person. One voice, one choice, could change everything. And sometimes, the most ordinary life could become extraordinary if you were brave enough to let it.